Okay guys, I'm sure a lot of you guys out there remember all the way back to November of 2017 when Matt Wagner, the senior producer over at Eagle Dynamics, published the very first cold start procedure tutorial for the FA-18C Lot 20 Legacy Hornet, and thus ushered in a new golden age of flight simulation software on the home PC. The FA-18C was the very first full-fidelity, pointy-nosed, fast jet capable of air-to-air combat published for DCS World and helped to push flight simulation software closer to the mainstream with such a popular aircraft. A lot has changed since November of 2017 in the flight simulation space and in DCS World in particular, but a lot has stayed the same. So there is no better place to start than a cold start procedure with the new 2022 FA-18C Hornet Tutorial series. Keep in mind, if you're new to the FA-18C and DCS World, this task may seem daunting, but with practice and repetition over time it'll get a lot easier. For mission planning purposes, always include 30 to 45 minutes to your mission for cold start, taxi, and takeoff procedures. When you start up your aircraft in DCS World, whether that's an FA-18, an A-10, an F-16, or a JF-17 or any other aircraft, always have a methodology that you use, whether that's a checklist or a mental checklist to actually go through the cockpit and ensure that you've gotten your aircraft fully combat capable. The methodology that works for me very well is to get all of the main systems online for the aircraft, the engines, the displays, the radar, and the INS, and then sweep across the cockpit starting from the left console, through to the left side of the instrument panel, the UFC, down into the center pedestal, the right side of the instrument panel, and finally finishing off down the right-hand side of the right console. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. First thing we want to do to start up an FA-18C Hornet is come down to the right-hand console and go ahead and flip the battery switch forward with a right click. In DCS World, as of January 2022, you can give a switch a left click to bring it backwards and a right click to push it forwards with your mouse. We'll then come over to the Fire Test A and B switch on the left-hand console. A right click brings it to the Test A position.
Engine fire left. Engine fire right. Engine fire right. APU fire. APU fire. Bleed air left. Bleed air left. Bleed air right. Bleed air right.
After Betty's recording has finished, we can go ahead and come back to the battery switch with a left click to bring it back to the off position to force the tapes to rewind. We'll then bring the battery back to the on position and we'll go to Test B channel with a right click.
Engine fire left. Engine fire left. Engine fire right. Engine fire right. APU fire. APU fire. Bleed air left. Bleed air left. Bleed air right. Bleed air right.
Awesome. Our test is now complete. It may surprise some of you out there that the actual recordings for Bitch and Betty exist on actual audio tapes of 1970s vintage, and that tape must be rewound for her to be able to replay those voice recordings. That system tests the ability of the aircraft to detect fire and shut the bleed air off from the two engines to prevent smoke or debris from getting into the cockpit in the event of an engine failure or fire. This is why we'll have to actually cycle the bleed air valves to get the ECS running to pressurize the cockpit and get us cooled down on this very hot Western Pacific day. Next, we'll come on back just outboard and aft of the throttle on the left-hand console, and with a right click, we'll turn on the APU. The APU, or Auxiliary Power Unit, is a small turbine engine that will supply air and power to our aircraft for engine startup. Once we have a green indication, that means we can actually start up our engines. But before that, it's getting a little bit loud, so why don't we go ahead and close the canopy. We can use our mouse with a left click to bring the canopy down, or we can also alternatively use a left control and C on our keyboard to lower the canopy as well. We want to make sure we press and hold until the canopy stops moving to ensure the canopy is fully locked. Just aft of the APU switch is the engine crank switch. We always want to start the right-hand engine first. This is because it will bring hydraulic power to the main systems of our aircraft and, more importantly, to our braking system. When you're on an aircraft carrier, this is especially crucial because that's where inches count when it comes to potentially losing an aircraft over the side of a ship and potentially your life as well. With a right click, we'll go ahead and crank the right-hand engine. Looking at the IFE, or Integrated Fuel and Engine Indicator, just below the left-hand DDI, once our engine RPM is above 20%, we can go ahead and hit right shift and home to bring our right throttle into the idle detent to allow the introduction of fuel to the combustion chamber and start up our turbines. The distinctive sound of the AMADs disconnecting and the flow of air from the APU to the turbine section of our engine is a very distinct sound. Living in San Diego, I used to hear this all the time at night as Marine Corps A-18C Hornets at MCAS Miramar started up their engines for night flights. We can see that our right-hand engine is started up and is at 65% RPM and a little bit above 300 for our temp. We can then go ahead and crank the left-hand engine, and while that is spinning up, we can bring power to our two DDIs, increase our HUD brightness and the brightness of our MPCD. We can see we're above 20% RPM, and with a right alt and home press on our keyboard, we can bring that left throttle to the idle detent and continue the startup of our left-hand engine. We can now see that our left-hand engine is settling right about 65% RPM, and our temperature is a little bit lower than our right-hand engine, but that should rise in a little bit. Keep in mind that your two engines will not always give the same indications, as two different F404 engines may behave in slightly different ways due to the age of the engine, the differences in metallurgy in the construction, or just various wear and tear on that engine throughout its service life. At this point, we can go ahead and come back to the right-hand console, right by our right hip, and bring our radar to the operate position, and bring our INS switch all the way to the 3 o'clock position for IFA. This is a new addition to the startup procedure of your FA-18 Hornet, as before GPS was integrated into the INS system of your FA-18, you would have to do a CV on a carrier or ground alignment if on the ground here. The new ability to go right to the IFA position means the INS will be aligned via GPS signals from the GPS constellation that exists in space all around us. This will allow us to align our INS even if we're moving on the deck of an aircraft carrier, taxiing, or even taking off. Next thing that I like to do is go ahead and turn off the map function of the HSI on our MPCD. We can go to the mode button and double click that center left OSB button, and that will turn off the map section and allow us to view the symbology on our HSI on our MPCD a little bit easier. At this point, guys, our FA-18 is more or less actually ready to go out and fly. However, we have a number of auxiliary systems that we need to turn on in order to actually get our FA-18C combat capable when we take off. This is where I like to actually start off from the left-hand side of my cockpit and sweep all the way across the cockpit, going to the right-hand side. So, starting by our left hip, we need to make sure that we get our OBOGs, or onboard oxygen generation system, turned on. This is a system that actually generates oxygen from the bleed air of our engines. This allows the aircraft to not have to worry about LOX bottles, which decreases the amount of maintenance required for the aircraft, as well as doesn't limit our range by the amount of oxygen that we actually carry on board the aircraft, because it's constantly being generated for the pilot to breathe. We can see on our left-hand DDI, we have a lot of warnings and cautions, and as we sweep through the cockpit, you'll see these cautions start to extinguish as we get the aircraft completely combat ready. Coming forward of the OBOGs, we're going to come to the FCS panel. Here we're going to hit the reset button to reset our FCS system and make sure that we can completely control the aircraft, and we're going to also set takeoff trim with the takeoff trim button. If you have an asymmetrical loadout, you may also need to move the rudder trim from the neutral position to give yourself a little bit better and easier time flying the aircraft with, say, a double ugly loadout. Moving forward, we want to ensure that our fuel dump switch is set to off, and we can also test our probe and extend it and ensure that we're going to be able to get fuel from a tanker for our long-range training mission for today. That looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and retract that. You can also see that after a little bit, our APU has automatically turned itself off via the spring loading inside of the switch. Once the engines have been running for approximately 2 minutes, the APU will automatically turn itself off. If you don't want to wait for that for any reason, if you have both engines running, please feel free to go ahead and turn off the APU manually. Coming forward, we're also going to want to turn on our position lights so that way other aircraft can see us a little bit easier in the airspace around us before we get into combat. And we just want to check to make sure that the HOTAS buttons on our throttle extinguish and turn on the lights no problems. Forward of that, we have the left-hand panel just forward of the throttle. The hook bypass should be set to field if you're at an airfield and set to carrier if you're on a carrier. Want to turn on our landing and taxi light, bring our flaps to half for takeoff, and ensure that if you are on an airfield, you have anti-skid set to on, and if you're on a carrier, ensure it's set to off. If you're on an aircraft carrier, do not want anti-skid accidentally turning on you and relieving braking pressure when you're just inches from the side of the aircraft carrier. That can be extremely hazardous to your health and the health of the aircraft if you leave anti-skid on while on the deck of an aircraft carrier. We want to make sure that our select jettison is set to safe, and we'll come towards our IFE here. For this sortie today, we've had a pre-brief Ringo setting of 5,000 pounds of fuel. The longer you hold the switch, the faster the counter will count up or count down. You can also move it in smaller increments if you need to. Coming up on our left DDI, want to go over to our HUD repeater. We can currently see that our only cautions and advisories on the left DDI are our left engine bleed off and right engine bleed off as well. The other caution here is INS degradation is not good for takeoff. However, that will be fixed as soon as the GPS aligns itself. Keep in mind that the GPS alignment for the INS that we're currently using at the moment is a lot slower than a stored heading alignment, but it really doesn't matter. If you take off with the INS degraded, but you're in the IFA position, you'll be just fine and you'll still have a velocity vector, you'll still be able to navigate no problem. Coming across to the UFC, we have our IFF. We'll just click that push tile, click the on-off button for approximately 1 second. Make sure that we get the symbology on the ODU and the scratch pad. We'll go to data link. We'll set that to on as well. We'll go to TACAN, and we'll go ahead and preset our carrier frequency for our TACAN. And we have it on transmit received. And then when we come to needing the TACAN later on, all we have to do is press the on-off push tile to ensure that that is good to go. But we'll go ahead and leave it off for now. Moving on to the right-hand MFD, we can go ahead and come over to the FCS page. We can currently see that our stab trim is set to 12 degrees. If you're taking off from a land base, the takeoff trim of 12 degrees on the stabs is absolutely adequate. If you're taking off from an aircraft carrier, you may need to increase the trim on the stabs based off of your loadout. There is an SOP for you to be able to calculate exactly how much stabilator trim you're going to need for takeoff of an aircraft carrier. However, just a rule of thumb that works just fine for DCS World pilots, if you are too wet carrying bombs on the carrier, you want to have your stab trim set to about 15 to 16. If you're 3 wet with bombs on the carrier, you want to have your stab trim all the way up to 18. If you are a very light loadout, you're clean, or just a very clean air-to-air loadout on the carrier, about 12 will do you just fine. So why don't we go ahead and bring the stab trim back down to 12. We're using our trim hat switch in order to manipulate the stab trim with nose up and nose down trim inputs. Coming down below the right DDI, we have our standby ADI, or attitude director indicator. Right click, drag up to bring away the flag, and we'll go ahead and reset our aircraft symbol back to the horizon. Coming down, we have our standby altimeter, and we're going to need to actually set our altimeter setting using this tiny little instrument down here. A lot of people will miss this in their cold starts. To find the current altimeter setting, it'll either be in the ATIS recording if your mission has an ATIS that you're flying in, or you can request it from ATC, or with a left Alt and B key on your keyboard, you can go down and find the altimeter setting in the weather briefing. You can see we have an altimeter setting of 30.02. We'll go ahead and input, scrolling our mouse wheel, 30.02, giving us our perfect altimeter setting for our field elevation we're currently at. Coming to the center pedestal, we can go ahead and hit the backspace key to get rid of our stick, so that way we can see around the stick a little bit better to see the center pedestal. We're definitely going to want to turn on our ALR 67 power push button, so that way we can get our raw equipment turned on and ready to go. Dispensers set to on, and our ECM set to standby. On my HOTAS controls, I always have the ECM to exit and receive position mapped to my throttle, so that way I can easily bring my ECM to transmit or receive if I'm getting engaged by an enemy radar guided threat. Also, don't worry about having your dispensers set to on or bypass while on the ground. You are unable to dispense any countermeasures with master arm set to safe and weight on your wheels. Coming around to the right hand side of our cockpit, we're going to go ahead and bring our radar altimeter. We're going to uncage it and set the warning to 600 feet AGL. This is kind of your standard, so that way when you're in the break and you're coming around for your base turn to land on the aircraft carrier, you'll get a nice bloop bloop warning sound once you hit 600 feet over the water. Coming down the right hand console, we can see our bleed air knob is currently set to norm. We need to cycle this switch 360 degrees in order to turn on the bleed air from our 2 engines. The fire test that we did earlier in this startup procedure actually shut off the bleed air from those 2 engines, and that is important that we see that that works correctly, so that way we know if there's a fire or any kind of catastrophic malfunction in the engines, we know that we will not have the cockpit filled with toxic smoke. So we'll go ahead and right click and bring that back to the norm position, turning it 180 degrees. We can now hear the ECS start up, and we can hear the actual cockpit itself pressurizing. We also have our anti-ice settings right here. If we're at a very cold airfield, we're definitely going to need to have these turned on. So if you're flying on the Caucasus in a snowstorm, make sure you get your pitot heat on and your inlet ice turned on as well. You will also get engine ice warnings on the left DDI if the aircraft senses any ice building up in your inlets. We want to definitely avoid this, as chunks of ice breaking off of our inlets and then being ingested by the engine will fog the engine and completely destroy it. So we'll go ahead and bring that back to auto. We also have our internal lighting controls for our instrument, consoles, floodlights, a chart light, and we can also adjust the warning and caution brightness as well. Sometimes when you're flying at night and you have some sort of catastrophic emergency and the master warning light is so bright you can't even see through your NVGs anymore, you're definitely going to want to know how to turn down that brightness. We can also adjust our internal lighting between the day mode, night mode, and NVG mode to be more friendly to our NVGs and our naked eyeballs at night. Coming down here, we also want to make sure that we get our FLIR, our targeting pod, on our centerline station of our Marine Corps FA-18C to the standby position. If you want to be kind of funny and cheeky while you're waiting to taxi with your friends, you can also bring it to the on position and actually take a look at your other friend's aircraft through your targeting pod while sitting on the ramp. Finally, we have our ejection seat arming handle right here on the right-hand console. We only want to arm that once we have ourselves taxied out and we're holding short of the runway. Ensure that you never arm your ejection seat if you're in a hardened shelter on the Caucasus map or on the Syria map. In an inadvertent ejection, the ejection seat will slam you into that hardened shelter and resulting in instant death. So we want to make sure that it's definitely not armed while sitting on the ramp. A couple more things that we can do to get our FA-18C Hornet completely combat ready is if we come down to our left DDI, we can open up the EW page, select our mode for our ALE-47, as well as go into our radar attack page and ensure that we have TWS selected for when we take off. Or go ahead and go back to the HUD page. Keep in mind that with weight on wheels, your radar is automatically put into silent mode. Another system we need to actually get sorted out and get operational before we can take off is our HMD. We need to go onto our right DDI, open up our bit page, go to our displays, turn on our HMD, look away from the field of view of the cockpit or the HUD so we can see the symbology, and click on the HMD button. We need to let the symbology on the HMD cycle through its bit at least twice. Before we manually stop it. And now when we go back to our support page, we should now have a new option on the left-hand side of the support page labeled HMD. We need to open this up, click on Align, use our Track IR or our VR headset to align the two crosses on the HUD, and with the two crosses aligned, we need to press and hold the cage uncage button, which is defaulted to the C key on your keyboard, to align the HMD. Alignment is now okay, and we now need to align a fine alignment for our HMD using the throttle designator controller cursor. We can move it left and right, and we first want to align the large cross with the small cross at the top. We can now press the cage uncage button one more time, and we need to align the roll. We need to have this smaller cross align with the large line on the bottom of the larger cross on our HUD. Once that's there, we can press the cage uncage button, and our HMD is now fully aligned. We can look away from the HUD, unbox align, and we now have a fully aligned and combat capable HMD. We'll go ahead and turn that off for now while we're taxiing around on the airfield. One more test we can perform on our FA-18C Hornet prior to takeoff is also the FCS bit or Flight Control System built-in test. This test is really only required if the aircraft has been sitting for a very long time or we're in a very cold environment in which the hydraulic fluid is actually having a harder time moving through the hydraulic lines of the aircraft. It's very easy to perform this test, and it is pretty cool because it does move the control surfaces of the aircraft all around. So, coming down to the right-hand wall of our FA-18C, we have an FCS bit switch right here just next to the actual flashlight that's on the right-hand wall of the cockpit. We can give this guy a right-hand click and hold while looking over to the FCS reset button and give that a left click and hold. We are now performing the FCS bit, and we can see The flaps, slats, ailerons, stabilators, and rudders moving through their range of motions to ensure that all the hydraulic fluid is moving smoothly through the lines that control these various flight control surfaces. And the longer we hold the bit switch, the further deflection of those control surfaces will become. This is to make sure your ground crew is fully satisfied with the range of motion of these flight control surfaces before they release you for taxi. Something to note with this as well is the fact that as of January 2022, you can actually press and hold 2 buttons at once using your mouse in DCS World. You can press and hold with 1 button, and then look to the other side and press and hold with another mouse button. So no more holding the Y key to perform that FCS bit. So with that, guys, we now have a fully started up and combat capable FA-18C Lot 20 Hornet in January of 2022. You'll notice that our INS DGO warning on our left DDI is now extinguished, and we have a fully aligned GPS INS system. And we are ready to taxi. So I hope this video helped you guys out, especially with developing a methodology that you can use to sweep through your cockpit in a very expeditious manner to get your jet started up and ready to go. So if you liked the video, please give us a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.